Sesame Street wants to teach kids computing. The PC Master Race is pissy that the NES is watering down gaming. And Sega teams up with iomega to bring zip drives to the Dreamcast. These stories and many more on this month's episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Makes him crazy, man. What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back. I'm Carl, and this is my co-host Peter. Say hi, Peter.
Hi.
Excellent. He follows instructions.
And passed the test. Did you notice something?
No, I didn't. What should I have noticed?
It is June.
It is June?
And we are recording the June episode. And if
No.
things won't go
Horribly wrong, you might say?
This is what I wanted to say. We are actually on air in June. And snap, things got horribly wrong. It's August.
It's not August. No. This will be out in June. Because this month we will look back at the biggest stories in and around the video game industry in June of 1979, 1989, and 1999. And as always, we'll mostly be using magazine cover dates, and those are of course always a bit behind the actual events. So, before we get started, remember, send comments to our Twitter feed at videogamenewsr2, or send us a comment by email, videogamenewsroomtimemachine, all spelled together, at gmail.com. And if you like what we are doing here at the podcast, don't forget to support us on Patreon. So, let's turn on the time machine and head back to our first stop, November. June of 1979. What's our first story?
Two-sided floppies.
That's right. Kilobaud magazine is reporting on a breakthrough in storage for your home computer. Are you still stuck using a single density mini floppy disk drive on your computer system? Do you want to unlock even more than the already massive 250K of storage? Well, with the new Wenco Model 82 drives, have not one but two optical hole sensors. For those not in the know, an optical hole sensor shot a beam of light through a hole in the disk to center it for reading and to confirm if write protection was active or not. By having both of these sensors, it was now possible to flip your floppy disk over and write to the other side of the disk, as long as you had an extra hole on the back. And how can you get that extra hole, you might ask?
Well, I would just use a hole punch.
Of course you would. And considering how cheap floppy disks were back then, of course people were just going to take a hole punch to that thing. Made perfect sense. So yes.
Well, just for the younger ones among us, did they hole punch the floppy?
Oh, hell yeah, we hole punched those floppies. We punched holes in those things all day long. Now, granted, I wasn't using a computer yet in 79. By the time I got my first machine in 84, prices for these things had come down. You could get a floppy disk for anywhere between $4 or $5.
Pre-punched.
No, we usually bought the non-pre-punch because they actually charged you more for the pre-punch.
No shit, there were actually pre-punched ones?
Yes, there were pre-punched ones. It was a awesome scam. You could actually pay extra for the pre-punched ones. And there was actually, you could buy hole punchers. By the time I was in gaming, there were specifically made little hole punches that would fit around the corner so you'd get exactly the right size hole clipped off the side of the floppy disk. Good times, man. Good times. And then how did you copy protect it? How did you make sure that the valuable data that you had stored on this floppy disk was never going to disappear?
Well, you just covered the hole, I guess.
Yeah, you put a little piece of tape on it. They actually had these
Really?
little silver pieces of tape that you could take on, take off, and they would sometimes come in the floppy disk containers. It would actually come with these extra little stickers that you could put on there.
Not bad, not bad. Did people actually buy this drive? I mean, a floppy disk. How much was a floppy disk back then?
Floppy disks in '79, I'd have to look up the price. You're probably looking at $10-12 in '79 terms. So that's it was an expensive thing. It was an expensive thing. And they may have already been a little bit cheaper by then, but to be honest with you, don't quote me on that. But they were still relatively expensive. If you think about it, in '79, the Commodore PET is still primarily a cassette-driven machine.
Okay.
And they were using cassettes not because they were faster or better, they were using cassettes because they were cheaper. So this is why floppy disks are becoming more common, especially in the U.S. market. In the European market, they don't really take hold until the 16-bit era. But in the United States, floppies are starting to already take hold because the people who are buying these things have a little bit more disposable income. It's a more enthusiast, hobbyist thing, but at the same time, these are people with a little bit more disposable income. Yeah.
Interesting.
It's not a kid's toy yet.
No. I just like the idea, like, hey, where's the hole punch? Well, Dad has it again.
Oh, I actually used regular hole punches a couple of times. I remember being furious that the disc wouldn't work, and it had a couple of discs where it looked like a little mouse had taken bites out of the disc because I had to hole punch it 3 or 4 times to get the right size hole for the dual-sidedness.
And it still worked.
It still worked as long as you didn't punch a hole into the actual round disc. You have to remember the little notch that you're punching in is a little bit higher up, so you could actually get away with that. Yeah.
So right next to the actual thing where the data is written on.
Yeah. Well, also, I mean, at this point, you also need the other holes that are going to be placed, but the primary hole that you were cutting was the one on the side of the floppy disk. And it wasn't really the disc that you were punching a hole in, you were just punching a hole in the outer sheath of the envelope, if you will, that it was packaged in.
Okay.
Yeah. Fun stuff. Okay, but enough about two-sided floppies.
And folds.
What's our next story?
Sesame Place Game Center. And
not Sesame.
It's messed it up.
Yes,
Sesame?
you did. Sesame.
What is the thing called you put on your bagel?
That's sesame seeds.
That's sesame.
That's where this is coming from. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
One more time from the top.
Proven I'm not an English native. Sesame Place Game Center.
Yes. The Children's Workshop, the company behind Sesame Street, is opening its first theme park in conjunction with Busch Gardens. The park, Sesame Place, will combine a variety of rides designed to help educate the most interesting one of these, at least from our standpoint, is the Game Center, which will have a variety of games running on microcomputers as well as dedicated cabinets for kids to play and learn on. Children's Workshop is working together with, amongst others, Atari and Creative Computing Magazine to deliver content for the center. The advantage of using microcomputers instead of dedicated systems is the ability to quickly modify programs if they are not performing well and to write new software for the center.
So it was basically a big hall with a whole lot of computers inside.
Not just a big hall. It was, from the photos that I've seen, it was slightly smaller spaces, not directly cubicles, but they had walls partitioning them probably so the kids could...
Not interact with each other, just with the machine.
Well, yes, they really wanted to prepare them for a life in the cubicle later. No, it was probably more to be able to hide a lot of the cables, because remember, Sesame Street is targeting, especially at this time, preschoolers and first and second graders. So you don't want a bunch of 5, 6, and 7-year-olds grabbing at the cables at the back of these machines.
Right.
And so what they did have it set up a little bit like that, but the primary focus was to introduce kids to computers and to give them that first experience of, how to type stuff in and so forth. Yeah. This was a theme park, but Children's Workshop has always been very focused on the educational aspect, not just the entertainment aspect. So the main focus of this was to educate kids on the use of computers.
And what were they doing in there? Doing some spreadsheets?
As far as I can tell, and I did quite a bit of research to try to find copies of the old programs that were in there and so forth, but I haven't been able to find anything online. But it seems to be that they had little educational tools where, they'd press the buttons on the keyboard and it would make text show up, or they had to match colors and things like that, just to give them an idea of how to use the computer, arrow keys and things like that, I'm guessing. But I honestly couldn't find any great detail on this. At first, I thought this may have been a flash-in-the-pan thing, that it didn't survive the first season or two of the park. But then it turned out, through my research, I found out that the Game Center, now called the Computer Gallery, ran until 1993, and it was then renamed into the Games Gallery.
Oh, really? Did they make a museum out of it?
No. That ran until 2003, and then they finally shut it down and turned it into Cookie's Cafe, a Cookie Monster-themed eatery at the park.
And they learned how to handle diabetes. Wonderful.
And they also got the kids prepared for menial minimum wage jobs in the future.
Dude, I really like their approach. First put them in the cubicles, and then when you don't need the cubicles anymore,
flip burgers.
Into the minimum wage.
Yeah, no. It seems to be that they just decided kids nowadays are so exposed to computers anyway that there was really no educational value in maintaining that aspect of the park. Also, because Sesame Street currently is targeting a much younger demographic, they're actually targeting 3 and 4 year olds nowadays. They're not a replacement for preschool in inner cities any longer. That the purpose of the park, the educational goals of the park have moved on, and you don't really have to teach a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old anymore how to use a computer, because
they can't do that.
They've all been babysat by mommy and daddy's cell phones at some point or another, so it's a done deal.
Dude, my cousin knows how to turn on his MacBook, not his MacBook, his parents' MacBook, and watch movies there.
And how old is he?
You don't want to know.
Tell me.
4.
4. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, come on. It's not rocket science. And it's just one of those things where the intuitive graphic user interfaces and so forth have kind of made this pointless. What you'd have to do is find a theme park that has a slightly older bent, and maybe try to introduce kids to practical computer skills like programming, or at least understanding what the hell is going on underneath the hood of the machine, which is sorely missing for the majority of young people today. Basic computer literacy is not how do I turn the thing on or how do I load a program. It should also still include, and this is my old man rant here, so anybody who's under the age of 25 and really only knows how to turn on their console, I'm sorry, this is not meaning to be insulting to you. For everybody else, you're nodding your head going, preach the gospel, brother. So the real problem here is that they don't understand the basic concepts of programming, of computer logic, of what's going on inside. And I'm not a programmer by any stretch of the imagination. Used to play around a little bit with code way back in the day, but I at least have those basic elements of understanding, those basic structures in my head of how it works. When I use Photoshop, I understand that I'm mixing RGB values and so on and so forth for each individual pixel, which, believe me, unbelievably helpful when it really comes down to breaking down what you're going to do with the image, or if there's a problem, being able to fix it, which a lot of people can't.
Brother, amen. But actually, I agree. I really can't stand it as well that a whole lot of my colleagues or friends, they're just like, yeah, it's a computer, but if there's a problem, I just call someone, mostly me.
And you're not even the tech guy.
And I'm not even a tech guy, but I can make the thing work.
Most
of the times.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
Okay. So this has been two guys bitching about the youth of today. Back to our regular
and wives, so just saying.
We have both girlfriends and wives. I'm going to make sure that my wife wasn't in earshot of that comment, because she's not supposed to. No, just kidding. Okay, so you have a girlfriend, I have a wife, and we're moving on. So, next headline, please.
Yeah, let's talk about sad things. And back to all companies go broke. Not yet. Mattel. We should have practiced that earlier, man. Mattel.
Why? This is the funniest part of the whole episode. People only listen to hear you screw this stuff up, so please continue.
I like people just listen to this podcast just because of me and not because of you, old man. Mattel earnings are down.
So,
right in your face.
Mattel's earnings are down, but their electronic games are up. Toy sales are still where Mattel either dazzles or disappoints. The dazzler is Mattel's electronic games business, which jumped 270% in the 1979 fiscal year and accounted for about 25% of the company's domestic, aka US, toy sales. And analysts point to Mattel's entry into the video games market in January with its computer-based home video system called Intellivision as its wisest move yet. So Mattel at this point, we've talked about it in several of the episodes now, they've launched a bunch of small LED-based digital games. We had the Mattel Football and so on and so forth. And now they're starting to get into the market with the Intellivision. And that's going to be their entry into the competition with the Atari 2600. And for anybody who doesn't know, Mattel, very, very famous toy company, been around for forever, and they see the writing on the wall. They've got to get into this business. And at the time, the analysts are thinking this is a great move by them. They understand toys, they understand how retail works, and they're going to be able to make a splash.
But today they're not in the computer games business anymore, aren't they?
Mattel is no longer in the video game business. The Intellivision is going to suffer a similar fate as, well, pretty much every other console maker at the time. The crash of '83 is going to take them down. Mattel, just like Atari, cannot conceive of anybody other than Mattel making games for their system. And the flood of cheap games that's going to hit the market is going to affect them just as much as it affected everybody else.
Okay.
And so, yeah, while the Intellivision, and we will get to this next year probably already. I want to say it's 1980 when they launched their comparison ads, but it might be 81. Intellivision has some of the most amazing advertisements ever for a video game system. In the days before in-your-face attitude that we got in the 90s, they do the corporate button-down, suit-wearing 80s yuppie version of in-your-face attitude. That makes no sense right now, and I don't want to spoil it for later, but when we get to those ads, you will understand what I'm talking about. Because they are so damn snarky. So in the 90s, we get the yeah type of stuff. Intellivision invents the about your pretty little game system type of ad. But they had already done that previously with other devices. So
they were bitching about their competitors.
Not bitching. They just simply
pointed out they're better.
Exactly.
And this is legal, or was legal?
It was completely legal. It wasn't really something that was done often, especially in the toy business. But in the toy business, you were never really comparing apples and apples before. You know, a Barbie doll and another kind of a female doll wasn't necessarily occupying the same exact space. You might have a different background story, might have a different aesthetic, and so on and so forth, so that you never really needed this one-on-one comparison. But now suddenly you've got tech. You can actually compare what's the resolution of your screen, what's the number of objects you have moving on the screen, what is the detail of those objects on the screen, and they use that in their advertisement. But like I said, that's something we will get to in a big bad way. Because I enjoyed those as a kid. They were fun to watch. And I wasn't that old, but I understood the message. I'm like 5 years old and I can still remember those ads on TV.
Really?
Yeah. They were just that impressive and just, yeah. But when we get to them, we'll see them. Okay?
Wonderful.
Cool. So, short 1979 this month. Don't worry, next month is anything but. And we have quite a bit yet to cover this month. So, let's turn on the time machine and head off to June of 1989. Proud of myself for saying that right. Welcome to June 1989, and it's hardware.
First, Atari 7800 headed to UK.
Atari is going to launch the 7800 in the UK. Yep, the console originally test released in 1984 and shelved due to the US console market crash is going to get a re-release in Europe as a budget console. The European release would get a joypad controller similar to that of the NES as opposed to the original controller that was launched in the US, and the machine would only be on the market in Europe until 1991, the time Atari would cease production of all of its 8-bit machines from the 2600 all the way up to the XE line.
So they basically emptied their warehouses.
Exactly.
Did it actually work? You know, they have a different video format, PAL, NTSC.
No, they did have to do some adjustments to the hardware. I mean, it wasn't just a straight dump of the stuff that was in their warehouse at this point. When Jack Tramiel originally took over Atari in '84, that is pretty much what he did, was just start selling stuff that was in the warehouse. At this point, they are manufacturing some of these things again, or at least adapting existing hardware stock, but the big question for them is just how are they going to gain any kind of market share, and they're just utilizing all of the technology and designs that they already have in stock or that they already own.
Mm-hmm. Is there a reason why they didn't earlier try to get rid of their old hardware?
Well, they did. It's just, you have to remember, you got the crash in '83. In '84, '85, there's just no market at retail. The retailers simply do not want any kind of video game hardware or software because they're still sitting on massive amounts of back inventory.
So you had the crash in '83 and they released that thing in '84, knowing that the retailers wouldn't like to sell their stuff.
You can't see it quite like that. What ends up happening is that the market goes kablooey Christmas of '82.
Yeah.
So '83 is when, remember, you're going to start getting the returns from the Christmas period in January, February, March. Mm-hmm. By the time the companies have gotten all the numbers back, you're deep into summer. By then, some orders had already been made for product for Christmas of '83. Not a lot. I mean, most of the big retailers realized very, very quickly that this was going the way of the dodo, or that they just didn't want to deal with it. And when you get to Christmas of '83, everybody's already standoffish. And Atari still thinks that they can save this, that they can still pull this out because they have to. Warner Brothers, the parent company, was so dependent on Atari revenue at this point to maintain their stock price.
Oh, really?
Oh, Warner Brothers buys Atari in the mid-'70s, but Atari very quickly, it's the fastest growing company in American history, very quickly Atari becomes the major driver of revenue and profits for Warner Brothers. Bigger than the movies and bigger than everything else. And this actually leads to them putting a lot of pressure on Atari to keep those numbers coming in and ignoring a lot of the warning signs that could and should have been coming out of Atari. And there is some dispute about whether or not the signals were really getting up to the top, whether or not people inside of Atari were kind of fudging the numbers.
So you have to make revenue no matter what the cost.
Because remember, these are stock corporations.
Yeah.
If they're not pulling in the numbers on a quarterly basis, then the management's going to get fired by the board and so on and so forth. So everybody is just trying to keep things going, hoping that this will just be a passing problem. But ultimately, if you go back to our original first episode, the November 78 episode, Nolan Bushnell was pushing for new hardware in 78.
Yep.
They don't get it. And they do release some new hardware, but it's all backward compatible.
It's no new hardware at all.
Well, it is. The 5200 does completely new things. The 7800 is definitely... The 7800 could have, under other circumstances, competed with the NES. It could have competed with the NES. But at the time it comes out, the test markets run, and they just can't interest the big retailers in purchases of the machine.
Because those guys already screwed up, and the retailers were like, we know you guys were just trying to pull off the same thing you did a couple of years ago.
Well, the problem is that the retailers aren't distinguishing between Atari and all the other people making third-party games.
But they distinguish between Nintendo and all the other people making games.
No, because Nintendo isn't going to hit the market for another 2 years. Nintendo's not going to test market until 86 in North America.
And this is when the market already consolidated.
No, the market, it doesn't exist for consoles. Between 83 and 86, there is no North American console market as such.
Well, this is actually what you can say about being consolidated. They're all just gone.
If zero is also a number, yes,
exactly.
if that's what you're trying to say. And I'm oversimplifying a little bit, obviously. And in Europe, there was never really a console market, so there couldn't be a console market crash.
So you can just dump whatever you have, it's gonna be new.
Well, kind of that's what's happening at this point. Okay. Throughout the 80s, you had the computer market. You had the computer boom. Mm-hmm. You had the bedroom coder. And Europeans were perfectly happy with the keyboard computer, the ZX Spectrum, the Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64, MSX, BBC Micro, the Dragon 32, and we can keep going.
All those little but pretty expensive things.
They were relatively expensive, but you have to also remember on the back end, you were saving a lot of money because almost none of the software was paid for. You weren't paying for any of the software, so from a parental standpoint, number one, you could say, hey, cool, the kid will learn how to use computers. And believe me, a huge chunk of the programming talent we have today, the heads of studios, the heads of companies, they all get their start at this point. There's a reason why there is a big, huge percentage of the current top talent in the industry comes out of this period. Even to this day. And these guys are just doing amazing stuff. They're creating a lot of the genres that we think of today, the open world games and so forth, all are born in this period on computer, not on console. Console doesn't really invent anything new in that sense, and I know I'm oversimplifying and people will start getting on my case, but console takes the ideas from computers and adapts them. Computers are the place where you can experiment because you're selling this thing on a tape or a disc that costs pennies. You want to make a physical cartridge with chips in it, you're talking $10, $20, and then once Nintendo gets into it, you also have to add the licensing and manufacturing fees that Nintendo is charging. You do not just release an experimental game on the NES for shits and giggles because it's going to be too expensive. You're not going to try to pull off something like a Doom Dark's Revenge or something just completely weird. Weird Dreams, for example, is a game from this period in 89. Just because it would cost too much to fail. Okay. Failure just isn't an option. Now, the flip side of that is obviously you're putting all that much money into a game. The Japanese learn very quickly, make sure the freaking game is good. Spend extra money on a designer, not just a programmer. Make sure the levels are well balanced. You're going to be very hard pressed to find a European computer release that has the longevity of a game like Super Mario Brothers, where every level, every stone in that game, every jump has been tested and made perfect. And the European games, as fun as many of them are, don't have that level of polish, partially because there's less money in it. They know everybody's going to pirate the thing, finish the program, get it out there, move on.
I just like the premise that back in the day the parents bought their kids a computer and be like, hey, here's a new piece of hardware, you're going to pirate the software anyways. So
well, the parents probably weren't thinking of that. Very few parents were probably thinking that. The big deal was the parents wanted the kids to have a computer to grow up on, and that was just the nature of the beast. And the consoles just didn't really penetrate. It's not really until partially the 16-bit generation. The UK has a very strong Sega Master System presence as far as 8-bit consoles are concerned, but it's really the PlayStation that breaks the European computer hold.
Okay. Huh. Well, it also is a nice way to re-educate people. I mean, when you give them a console with a game ready on a disc or cartridge or whatever, people don't need to have programming skills anymore.
And we're back to the topic,
exactly.
Our previous topic.
And overarching today.
It is really, it's difficult to, or it's the barrier to make that jump to the program or to do artwork and so forth is pretty hefty. Luckily, around the same time, you do get Windows 95, which in many ways is also a gateway for more people to have easier access to computing. It's simplified a lot of stuff. Plug and play cards for the computer really made things a lot easier and increased the vast number of people using PC compatibles. At least in North America, but when you really talk about on a global scale, the keyboard computers of the 80s and 90s, that 8 and 16-bit generation, we were all either coding or doing some kind of graphic routine or demoing or, even if you were doing something that looked absolutely horrid, you were still putting a splash screen on a copy of a game before you gave it to your friends or something. There was a lot you could do there, and the console people just didn't necessarily have that same experience, sadly. So Atari is basically trying to just gain some market share. They think if they've got enough product on the shelves, everything will be okay. Unfortunately, they just can't deliver enough product to really make this a viable option.
Were there any markets they targeted specifically?
No, I couldn't find anything in particular. Atari was quite strong in both Germany and the UK, but the 7800 just it was a hunk of junk by then. Unfortunately, it has some very interesting titles, and the chipset in it is actually quite strong. Like I said, I really think it could have given the NES a run for its money. They're both released in '84, but it just never really stood a chance. So, okay, next story.
Moving on. Apple looks poised to kill the Apple II line.
Rumors are flying that Apple will finally put an end to the venerable Apple II line of machines that have been on the market since 1977. With the Mac being the company's flagship product, the question is whether Apple can get the all-important educational market to finally shell out for the far more expensive Mac line of machines. Apparently, internal arguments made by the Apple II engineering team are that there is a lot of life left in the Apple II architecture, and they seem to have won the day because the last Apple IIe machine wouldn't roll off the assembly line until 1993.
And this is what happens when you let an engineer decide. This tech is awesome, it still works. Yeah.
But actually, the Mac was a loser, a money loser for a long, long time. And to be honest with you, the Apple II design, Wozniak's design, is as close to perfection as you're ever going to get. It is a brilliant piece of hardware doing amazing things with extremely limited capabilities. The fact that it could do any form of color graphics, given the limitations of what he was dealing with, is still quite astonishing. And the Apple II architecture built off the 6502 chip line, the MOS 6502. And a later variation of the 6502, I'm going to mangle this, I think it was the 65N something or other. It was a 16-bit variant on the chip that was developed by one of the original designers. That was used in the Apple II GS, and that was basically a 16-bit computer that could do some very amazing things. The only problem was that they never really got the price down. And
even after 12 years.
Well, no, they kept improving it, but they were always more expensive than the competition. The Commodore 64, which used a similar chip, the 6505, to the original Apple II line, was always just a fraction of the Apple computer. I mean, a complete setup of the Apple II at it, even in, let's say, 83, was going to put you back at least $1,200.
Really?
And a complete setup for the Commodore 64 was going to run you at most $700 to $800. And you were going to get more colors on screen. You were going to get simply an easier to use computer that was going to be far more accessible. And if you wanted to, you didn't actually have to buy a monitor. You could save a couple $100 on that price tag. Don't buy a monitor. Hook it up to your television set.
So you had a computer with a better compatibility. It was
well,
cheaper.
Compatibility, you have to be very careful. None of these are compatible with one another.
No, speaking of monitors, no. Monitor, TV screen.
Yeah.
So it was easier to hook it up.
Yep.
It was cheaper.
Yep.
It had more power.
Yep.
Showed more color.
Yep.
Why did the Apple II survive for 12 years?
Well, actually, the reason for that is something that we're going to find out next month. There's a story there. But that will come in next month's episode.
Alrighty.
See? Spoiler. No, it's not a spoiler. Sorry, this is a preview. Look forward. You got to come back next month for that story.
Anyhow. But the strategy of Apple to charge more for their products, I think they stood true to themselves. Even today.
Oh, definitely.
This one piece of aluminum for this new Apple kind of MacBook thing, not MacBook, sorry, the new Apple
now
computer
remember, we don't know when people will listen to this. When you say the new one, you have to specify.
New in 2019.
No. Say which piece of hardware you're talking about.
The stand. It's just a piece of aluminum where you put your all-in-one computer Apple thing on. It's just.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Are you talking
stand.
the
It's
back?
just a stand.
It's just a stand.
It's just a stand. It's like $1,000.
For what? For a tablet?
No, for this new. I don't know what the thing's called. I'm not an Apple user. We might want to cut this out.
Yeah, probably. Okay, if you... He doesn't understand the rules of this. I'm sorry, people. Okay, this is why... If he had to edit this just once. Okay, so, no. Yeah, no, they always stuck with the idea of charging a little bit more. Now, granted, they were usually using slightly better equipment than everybody else. But even then, it just wasn't justified. Their fight to try to get rid of the Apple II line was probably wrong-headed at this point, but at the same time, they couldn't really keep two incompatible lines of hardware running forever. Sooner or later, the Apple II was going to have to die. The Mac was going to have to take over, and 93 was that moment. So, but... The thought is apparently already quite vivid. Otherwise, Compute magazine wouldn't be talking about it at this point.
So that the Mac is at least 4 years old when it took over.
What do you mean took over? No, it's been out since 77, so it's been out for 11 years. The architecture's been there.
No, I mean the Mac.
The Mac has been out since 84.
So it took 9 years for it to take over the
To
Apple
replace it.
The Apple II.
Yeah, but remember, there's legacy machines will be around for a while sometimes. But yeah, the Mac also goes through massive changes in the meantime.
Well, screw Moore's law.
No, things kept getting better, I guess. Sorry, not a big Mac fan, so can't really support that idea. But okay, on to the next story.
Yeah, Intel introduces the 486.
That's right. The i486, a reduced-size 386 chip with built-in cache and math coprocessor, is the latest addition to Intel's x86 line of processors. While it's going to be expensive for a while, the 25 MHz base version will put you back a whopping $950 at the time, and the 33 MHz version will cost $1,400. It is a clear sign that the future of high-end gaming is on the PC. The new chip's introduction will also have a positive effect on reducing the prices of older 386 chips, with the 386SX model dropping to an affordable $90.
You know, and this is something that is really interesting to me. I actually had a look at the articles this time.
Ooh,
my little research
yes.
monkey. Yeah, I did some preparation. Forget the
Happy
Apple
computer.
thing we talked about.
Yeah.
Anyhow, and a computer by the time costs like 25,000 bucks. German
No,
currency
not
by the time.
25,000. 2,500.
No, the entire computer system was 25,000 bucks. The article said
It wasn't 25,000.
2,530 zeros.
For what? For
For the entire computer system
what,
with the 33
what system are you
megahertz.
talking about? You have to specify. We just mentioned 3 different systems.
And the 33 megahertz version. A
Okay,
computer with
so
a
the
33
one with the
megahertz version.
$1,400 chip.
Yes.
Well, it depends on what you're putting in it. Remember, this is a PC. So you could be talking about how big is the hard drive, what kind of video card, the sound card. All of these factors are going to alter the price. What were they adding into the $25,000 system?
I don't know.
Here, one sec. We're going to pause for a moment and check out the article again. So please stick with us. So, after the judges have looked at the playback, yes, the article from the Happy Computer magazine, German computer magazine from the 80s, does in fact say that it would be 25,000 marks, which would roughly be about $10,000 for a machine at the time. I'm guessing they're talking about some kind of high-end server type of machine or workstation, because, yeah, I can't imagine what parts they're adding into this thing. It's not like we have a massive video cards with memories and stuff. But hey, who knows? They're probably just talking about the fact that there's probably only one manufacturer of motherboards for this new 486 chip slot at this point.
So being able to charge what they want.
Pretty much, yeah. It's good to be king, as what they say. So yes, you are correct. I'd forgotten they put that in there, but they don't specify anything, so it's kind of a ephemeral number.
But good that we talked about it.
Exactly. And see, kind listeners, we made sure that you did not have to sit through us checking the sources again. But, okay, that's the 486. It's coming. It's going to be badass. And it will put a hole in your pocket the size of Montana. On to the next story.
VESA Standard is coming to enhanced VGA cards.
The Video Electronics Standard Association, founded in November 1988 by NEC, the Japanese computer giant that also made the PC Engine console, announces a new video standard for PC clones, which would later become known as Super VGA. Classic VGA is a proprietary standard owned by IBM. The new standard created by the VESA group of companies would up the 640 by 480 resolution of standard VGA to a whopping 800 by 600. VESA would later introduce many more graphic standards and help solve the mess created by multiple card makers creating their own standards.
A good thing. I mean, standardization in this market is always a good thing.
And very much so. And this was one of the big problems that had plagued PC gaming up until this point. That if you wanted to do something beyond the 640 by 480 resolution, which was relatively low, especially because you didn't have interlacing like on an RGB monitor or the systems that connected to TVs, it really did hamper what you could do with the graphics. And anybody who created a new standard, and there were several companies creating graphic cards at the time with varying standards, just meant that your game had to be reprogrammed again and again and again. So this a Super VGA standard opened it up 800 by 600. Then we got 1024 by 768, and so on and so forth, until we got to the massive resolutions that we have today. So it's the first step. The PC is coming. And
Definitely.
let's find out what's going on in the non-PC compatible world.
Yeah, Konix specs revised.
And the Konix multi-system has been gone from its original 128K memory spec and has been bumped up to 256. Disk access was found to be not fast enough for continuous data streaming, and so the cartridge slot can now be used as a memory expansion slot, similar to what we later see with the N64, and release for the system was been pushed back to September. Now, just for everybody's edification, if you don't remember, the Konix multi-system was an English game console that we talked about in a few episodes already. Konix was the maker of peripherals, primarily for this Sinclair Spectrum. They did a lot of joysticks and things, and they were trying to leverage their knowledge of peripheral making into making a game console that was actually going to be very similar to a home computer, was going to provide floppy disks as well as cartridges as possible storage medium for games. And they've been talking a lot about it, but the magazines have yet to show an actual screenshot of any game, and they just keep showing us the wonderful peripherals like a seat that will vibrate and move as you pilot games, as your giant RGB monitor is sitting on this little podium in front of you, or flight sticks and driving wheels that will all be accessories available for the Konix system.
So they made advertisement for their new console, and they only showed peripherals.
Pretty much. And the best part is in this story in the Games Machine is that the developers haven't gotten their dev kits yet. And the magazine themselves says they can't see how they'll make an August launch deadline, given the fact that the developers don't even have dev kits to start developing games on yet. And while this is being published in June, I'm guessing it's written probably a month or two earlier, but that's still not a lot of time to finish up a game.
Do I have to wait 2 months, or will you just tell me whether or not they made the August deadline?
They did not make the August deadline. They made no deadlines.
Yeah.
And the fun part is that the team that started work and was developing the Konix, we will see them again. They will be involved with another relatively infamous piece of hardware a few years later.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you'll let me wait a few years, or you just tell me after we switch off the mic.
Well, most of the people listening to us already know. So yes, I'm going to leave you in the dark. And at some point, I will mention again the Konix, and you'll go, the what? And I will go
Most
through
likely.
this spiel again, because, you know, it's rehashing old material is kind of what we do around here. So it works. Yeah.
Wonderful. So that thing was never released.
Never released, never got
released.
out, and it was basically vaporware almost from the get-go.
So much time wasted.
Yeah. And we're not done with English hardware developers just yet.
Yeah, speaking of delays, Coupe delayed to September.
That's right. The unofficial follow-up to the Sinclair Spectrum, well, it's gotten delayed to September. Again, here, just like with the Konix, dev kits won't be out until June. And the single model that will now be released, originally we were talking about multiple different models for the system, will be sold through retailers, not mail order as they had originally hoped. So the original business model was to make this high-end 8-bit computer as everybody was moving to the 16-bit machines. It was going to be backwards compatible with the Sinclair Spectrum, which was kind of the flagship of English computing design, and it was going to be sold through mail order, which I didn't see this in any of the articles, but the idea would probably have been, you know what, this will actually reduce the cost because we don't have to pay anything to the retailers for markup. And now they've abandoned their idea for multiple different levels, tiers of the machine. They've abandoned their idea to do their own mail order, probably because it would have necessitated more internal infrastructure at the Sam Coupe company. And, well, the people who are supposed to be making software for this thing still haven't gotten their dev kits. So, yeah. We will see what happens with the Sam Coupe.
I don't know. I really have a problem with mail, or I mean, yeah, I can see the advantages of this.
Of course.
You don't waste shelf space. But Amazon wasn't invented yet, so...
Well, the idea is the magazine still carried a lot of weight back then. And these are... we're pulling these from articles in the magazines, not from advertisements in the magazines. Yeah. But this is space that the magazine is dedicating to these news stories, which are actually getting the word about the hardware out. But at the same time, a magazine giveth, the magazine taketh away, because the magazine can also tell the world, you know what, this looks like a bad idea. And the fact that they're reporting not only on the fact there'll only be one model, which for a consumer may actually be a good thing, because it means I don't have to make a decision but which model I want to buy, and I won't then feel like a jerk because I didn't get the model with the extra feature that I desperately needed. But at the same time, they're telling people the dev kits aren't out yet, which means you're kind of not going to get anything. There's not going to be any real software ready. So these are news stories and thus don't really function as advertisement. But at the same time, people now know that this thing is coming. If they're interested, they can keep an eye out for it. But getting into retail is a pain in the butt, and if retail doesn't work for you, it can really burn you. So we will see what happens to the Sam Coupe. And
the day of postponing information.
Yeah, you can look it up if you want. Hey, it'll be fine.
You're my research monkey.
Yeah, good point. Okay, now leaving the world of hardware behind, let's get into the old man rant.
Yeah, and I actually really like this topic. Compute editorial dismisses NES and bemoans dumbing down of computer games.
The main editorial in this month's Compute magazine prepares the reader for the evil onslaught of the NES.
Couldn't be more pathetic.
Something like that. Unlike consoles of the past, this one is here and here to stay, it seems, and it is spreading its evil stench all the way to the green pastures of the PC master race, even though they weren't calling themselves that quite yet. The editor bemoans in his last editorial as lead editor of the magazine that the dumbing down of PC gaming is on its way, and that games like Legend of Zelda prove how superficial the console experience is in comparison with PC games like Ultima.
Yeah, I actually read this article as well, and I don't know, somehow it felt like an old man, like, you know, the old lion who has to leave for the new lions to come, and he's like, things were better back in the days.
Kind of. I mean, superficially, I can understand some of the arguments he's making. I can understand the idea that, you know, if you do have a proper storage medium like a disk drive, if you do have a full-blown keyboard, if you do have an expandable computer platform, the richness of the experiences you can create is potentially greater. I mean, you could have a game like Wasteland or Ultima 4 with all of its deep nuance and multiple storylines and so on and so forth more easily on a computer at this point in time. But what he's missing here, in my opinion, is the fact that the reduction of the controls, the limitations of the cartridge format, which in the case of Legend of Zelda, it was originally a Nintendo Disk System game in Japan, launched in the United States with a battery backup save feature built into the cartridge, so you did have these save features and so forth. And what he's missing here is the fact that when you do reduce down the controls, you're forcing the designer to actually find a way to make the storytelling work more cohesively with the technology, as opposed to many of the PC efforts at the time of storytelling and gaming. And here I'm thinking primarily of the RPGs, because that's really the big thing he goes after. He also goes into strategy games a bit, but in the RPG sector, a lot of the RPGs at the time are just replicating the pen and paper Dungeons and Dragons experience. Ultima, of course, is a huge exception. At this point, we've already got Ultima 4 and 5 out. The really, never quite beaten morality structure to the decision-making trees in Ultima 4 was groundbreaking for its time. It really was one of a kind. But Ultima 4 does get ported to the NES. I can't say out of personal experience if it was a complete experience. I think I remember hearing that they had to cut some things out of the game, but for the most part, it was the Virtue system. Same thing with the Sega Master System port of the game. So I don't think that the consoles weren't capable of it. But what I do think, and this is what he's really missing, is the fact that the console experience forces the designer to find better ways of doing this other than through massive amounts of text or typing in commands, which is what adventure games were still doing at this point. In '89, we still don't have the proper point and click icon-based interface. We've got Maniac Mansion already out there, and that has the SCUM system that uses words to choose to build sentences, but a pure iconographic system isn't there yet because, in my opinion, they're still thinking of these things as computers, and computers do words, and we've been playing Zork and Leather Goddesses of Phobos and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and all the Infocom adventures or The Hobbit for so long at this point that the idea of a computer game without words feels wrong.
I'm just wondering what this guy would have said if we told him that games like Fortnite will exist someday.
He probably would just look at it and call it another dumbed down experience, and not see the benefits of real-time strategy. I mean, Fortnite is a massively strategic game. It requires you to basically play three-dimensional Tetris while you're still trying to do a headshot. I have to defend Fortnite here, despite all the other social implications of it, as a game that really is a wonderful mixture. It's not my original idea. I heard somebody else say this, but they said it's the perfect jumping off point for the Minecraft generation to get into the shooter genre. Because you have a bunch of kids that have spent the last 15 years plus, actually more than 15 years now, playing games, playing Minecraft, where they build things
up, and now they end up puberty and start destroying them.
Well, no, in Fortnite you're still building your fort as you're blowing the other side up. So you're building it, but at the same time you're also multitasking and destroying, and then you still have the group mechanic, and you also have the technology to make the group mechanic more real, where you can actually talk in real time. You're not just using simple little shortcut commands. You're actually talking to one another, which is something that in the old days wasn't possible. And this goes back to the very late 90s. I remember one of the first professional gamers, I believe his name, he was going by the handle Thrash or Thresh. Somebody can correct me in the comment section. and he was writing columns for PC Gamer magazine at the time. He was the world's #1 Quake player. And he wrote a story about how his team had gone to a competition in someplace in Scandinavia. I think it was Sweden or maybe Norway. And they got their asses handed to them. And one of the problems was when they got there, they weren't used to talking to the other members of the team out loud.
Okay.
And the other team they were used to LAN parties. His team was used to playing over networks.
Okay.
And because at the time you couldn't do audio in real time over a network and play the game
and
without massive
would
lag,
have been too expensive.
And having a chat line running separate wouldn't have worked either. So what they were doing was they were used to using quick little hints back and forth over the network. But once they were faced with these guys who were used to just yelling out commands to one another, and they had their own codes and everything, very quickly that was a disadvantage. So much so that they couldn't coordinate their moves fast enough to compete with these guys, and they just got creamed. And even talked about how they tried to compensate, and then they were yelling out commands like, "Oh, the yellow vest or whatever is over here." Well, now the other team knew where they were. Then they tried to invent a code system on the fly in the middle of the competition, like calling the yellow vest a banana or whatever.
That always works.
Which didn't work either, and so on and so forth. And it was a fascinating little commentary on how one little element could completely change the strategy. And again, Fortnite has that speech element, which the editor here at Compute wouldn't have been able to understand at the time. And so I think that there's so much evolution that has happened here, and the idea that limitations can actually lead to better game design in the long run. I mean, chess does not become the greatest game in the world, or the most, by some people's opinion, most challenging. Go, of course, being maybe even more challenging game in the world without the limitations. The limitations make it great, not the words. And I think that that's kind of the problem here, that he's just not seeing how the reduction to a purely visual medium is actually making Legend of Zelda a new, more immersive experience for many people than the more verbose traditional RPGs. I mean, Ultima at this time is pretty much just icons moving back and forth. We don't have that weird 3/4 view that we would get with Ultima 6 yet. It's still the straight little icons, not very immersive. But Link running around in real time killing monsters, that is a more visceral experience that doesn't necessarily have to lose the exploration aspect or the storytelling aspect.
Preach to the choir, man.
What can I say? It's there's a place in the world for all of this. I mean, I've loved playing the old RPGs. I've loved playing the point and click. I've enjoyed action RPGs. Unfortunately, never really got into Zelda. I have to admit it, but wrong generation, didn't have the console at the right time. Blah blah blah.
It's just so interesting. I mean, for me, playing those old games, I can see why people like them. It's just all so slow, you know? And I'm so used to so games that are way faster.
Yes and no. You have to remember, faster in
terms of reaction time. I mean, and I just played Leisure Suit Larry 1, and I really have problems of...
Well, that's a point-and-click adventure game.
It is a point-and-click adventure. Not with the real old games, but still, even with that.
No, but still, that's a different experience, because there you could literally leave Larry standing on the side of the street for the next 20 hours, and nothing would happen in the game, because it is a turn-based game. It's a turn-based game. It's like comparing Command and Conquer with Civilization. If you don't do anything, if you walk away from your PC in Civilization, nothing's going to happen. It's a turn-based game. The computer is waiting to react to your move. Whereas an action game like a Zelda game, which is a real-time adventure game, is a different experience.
Well, this is true, and this is what I'm saying.
But you still enjoy playing Civilization.
To a certain point, yes.
Okay, so you're not saying that you think it's too slow. What are you saying? Because otherwise Civilization would have no interest for you because it's the same mechanic of waiting to react to you.
There's just, according to, of course, due to the limited technology, there's just so few things that happen, you know?
You mean there's less elements to keep track of in the game? Well, yes, of course. And those are limitations of memory and so forth. And the idea of the big empty world. I mean, if you go back and play Grand Theft Auto 3 today, the first one with the 3D rendered world, it feels empty by comparison with the later games. But at the time, we were completely immersed. I mean, I remember playing that for hours and hours on end, which probably didn't help my grades in my second year of law school, but that's another issue entirely. The idea with it, though, was that it felt so immersive and it felt so real at that point, just because we had never seen anything like it before.
I had the same with GTA Vice City.
Exactly,
back in the day, it was actually the first GTA I've played, and it was like, wow, and now, just recently I had a look at it on YouTube, and I was like, Jesus.
Well, it's the same game engine. Same game engine. And this is very, very important, especially when you're looking at these games. You have to see them within the confines of the time. And many games are fun to look at from a historical standpoint. I'm the first one to admit most of the games I've played in my life, and literally they have been in the thousands, I would not go back and spend any considerable amount of time with anymore, just because the concepts and the ideas of that game design have been reiterated in better, more modern forms on hardware that has surpassed the limitations of the old hardware. Now, that's not to say that you can't get more out of those old war horses. There are some amazing games just released. I mean, I've spent way too many hours the last few months playing Yump on the Yump 64. And I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but it's an amazing little Commodore 64 abstract action game. Mm-hmm. You play this ball and you're bouncing around and trying to avoid the holes as you travel through this tube. Great little effect for a Commodore 64 to get that 3D effect of the tube working is already a massive success. Mm-hmm. And to be a fun and challenging game on top of that, even more so. I've picked that up and play that every couple of days for like 10, 15 minutes here and there.
And then you're bored?
No, I just do it late at night. I just don't have time right now. I got too many other things going on. But it's one of those quick little pick it up arcade style games where you play your however many lives and then you die and that's it. And then the question is, do you want to continue? And you say, no, because it's an arcade style game. It's not about continuing ad nauseum until you get to the end. It's a different type of experience. Mm-hmm. It's the fast, give me that action, give me that adrenaline rush, let me walk away experience.
This is actually Super Mario for me. You just go in, play a level, and that's it.
Well, the only problem is if you're doing that, you're always playing the same exact level over and over again.
Well, there are so many levels, and if you just play one level at a time.
Yeah, but then you can't, the game doesn't allow you to store unless you're using a save state.
Well, you stop contradicting me.
I'm just pointing out logical fallacies in your statements.
I still like Super Mario.
Nobody is denying that. But you should be playing it on the Commodore 64 now that there's a 1-to-1 port.
Oh, okay.
Excellent. And you didn't hear that from us because Nintendo forced them to take it off the web. But yes, Super Mario Brothers on the C64. Find it, kids. It's fun.
And there goes our podcast.
Yeah. Okay, so that concludes the discussion for 1989. Let's turn on the time machine and head over to June of 1999. Welcome to June 1999. Where are we starting at?
Arkansas law banning public exhibition of violent arcade games gets shelved.
Following the Jonesboro shooting in 1998, where 2 kids killed 5 and injured 10 more, and yes, it's hard to think that at that time it was the second deadliest school shooting in the U.S. Well, as a reaction to that, the Arkansas Senate Bill S-925 was written, and it would have banned the public display of violent games to people under the age of 18. This law would have treated violent games similar to the way pornography is in the U.S. The law died in committee, though, after arcade operators agreed to label arcade games voluntarily.
And this is the thing I don't really get about the U.S. You have this horrible thing, this school shooting, and the first go-to is you ban violent video games.
Wait. You really want me to get into this political minefield? No. Okay. Here's the way to understand it. The right to own guns by many in the United States is considered to be a sacred cow. It can do no wrong. It can never be the reason for anything. I'm not saying it was the reason in this case, but it cannot be the reason for something. Therefore, you need to find something else. And America has a love-hate relationship with the media. If you go back to the 1950s, it was comic books. That's when they took EC Comics, Bill Gaines' comic book company, and that would lead to the creation of Mad Magazine later on. They tore him apart and created the Comics Code. During the 1940s, you had the Zoot Suit people, then damn music, unpatriotic, blah, blah, blah. America loves to hate media.
And I totally get why they don't want to ban guns. I don't support it. I just kind of get it, It's like you forbid people to drink beer in Germany. It's like, no, you can't just... There are things you just can't do.
That's true.
But why not movies?
Well, see, they've done the movie thing before, and movies were being consumed by adults, and the adults making the laws wanted to watch Scarface and Godfather and other movies with Al Pacino playing a gangster.
Yeah, but you can... What Peggy were those games? Those movies. What?
Scarface. Well, the version I'm talking about with Al Pacino is 1982. Godfather. Well, you get Godfather 3 in the early 90s.
And how old did you have to be in order to be able to watch it? Without parents?
Without parents, I believe those were all R-rated movies.
Oh, okay. So they already did it with the movies. Okay.
Yeah. So, and this is why the voluntary labeling. And I actually remember when these things showed up, they were on the top marquee of the arcade machines usually, and they would be like this little green sticker or a red sticker or a yellow sticker or whatever. And unlike many other forms of self-censorship or self-labeling where they really did care about it, it literally, the stickers showed up and then nobody cared. I remember walking into arcades and seeing a ton of red stickers everywhere and nobody cared. It was completely and totally pointless because at this point, the people going into the arcades, the teenagers and stuff, didn't care. The adults, for the most part, had let it slide, and there was no way to really police who was walking through these arcades in a mall. So, yeah, it was a non-issue. I mean, I still went out and played my House of the Dead games and whatever else. I mean, I was already past the age of 18 at this point, but it just wasn't an issue.
It wasn't for you anyways.
Yeah. Okay,
all right,
so
on.
The Arkansas law is dead. Moving on.
Titus buys
Titus.
Titus. There's actually a book. Titus doesn't come every day. It's like we had to read it in class 5. And so this is...
Titus.
Yeah.
Spelled
Titus.
this way.
Yeah, exactly.
No.
Yeah, it is. It is in German, obviously.
It was a Roman
This book.
emperor.
Exactly.
Titus.
Yeah,
It's
Titus.
okay. Titus. Please keep going.
Titus. Anyhow, Titus buys a 30% stake in Interplay.
Interplay, the famed creator of PC role-playing games, has been tail-spinning since going public in 1998. We talked about that on a previous episode. Their failed attempt to get into movie production has sapped their cash, and their lack of any real console presence has finally forced them to accept big financial help from outside. Titus, the French publisher of some of the worst games of the time, and yes, I'm looking at you, Superman 64, has money to spare, thank you to the French stock market. Ultimately, Titus would acquire Interplay outright a few years later before folding entirely on its own.
It was a really big bubble in the French computer game market.
It was basically what the Americans had as the dot-com boom around the same time, and the Germans had in movie licensing rights. It was just this global phenomenon where a lot of stock markets found one niche market they thought was going to be this big thing, and there was this general feel amongst the middle class, and here we're getting a little bit into business and economic history. The middle class was really feeling the pinch of not having savings, not being able to ever retire, lower earnings, and they needed to find this golden ticket that was going to give them the money to retire on, and they were just
totally
finding for it. And unless you sold your stock on time, it did not work out very well for you.
Yeah, but
Nope.
most of the middle class surely didn't. Because they didn't know what they were actually dealing with, It was a time of everyone's like, you have to buy stock. I in my family have some people who in that time bought stocks, and now looking back, like, oh geez, you were so dumb.
Well, and since they were in Germany, they probably bought stocks in my former employer, Kinowelt. So, yeah. And anybody who wants to find out about it, just Google it. Fun stories. Okay.
Yeah, I never hired this guy. Every company...
Wait a sec. I worked at them after that, okay? I did not work for them before that. And yes, I have worked at many, many companies that have gone broke. But I say that it has nothing to do with me. And that's what I'm going to keep saying for liability purposes. Okay, next story.
Moving on. Free Radical Design signs up with Eidos.
That's right. This is the first of two companies we're going to be talking about today that have relatively interesting roots, have just been started, and are looking for big publishing deals. Now, Free Radical Design has just been formed. Studio is made up primarily of former Rare staff who worked on the N64 classic GoldenEye. And they've signed a publishing deal with Eidos. Now, Eidos is basically this English company, lots of money, flashy stuff, doing some impressive things here and there. Becomes a bit of a cluster later on, but at this point, they're like the cool kid publisher on the block.
Are they those guys with the lizard as a mascot?
You're thinking of Gex. That was Crystal Dynamics. Huh. But I do believe Eidos had the publishing rights to the Gex character for a while, but I'd have to look that up again.
Okay.
Now, their first release, Time Splitters, first release of Free Radical Design, would be a launch title for the PlayStation 2 and spawn a cult classic series. The studio would also only release first-person shooter titles and later get taken over by Crytek, becoming Crytek UK. And in 2014, it was acquired by Deep Silver, a subsidiary of Koch Media, and rebranded Deep Silver Studios, the name it still operates under today. So the studio is still around.
They actually had a whole lot of good games, at least being the publisher of those.
Well, no. Free Radical Design was the design company.
No, I'm speaking of Deep Silver Studios.
In Deep Silver Studios, yeah. I mean, and yeah, this is one of those publishers and developers. I mean, because they're Deep Silver Studios is the developer that has really been able to always stay one step ahead of the curve. So a pretty cool story that they're still around, and like I said, Rare staff from back then. I don't know all the history of why they left Rare at the time, but I'm going to just guess they figured out they liked their first-person shooters and wanted to keep going down that road. So, and the other studio is... Wait for it. We're looking it up. Oh, there we are.
Yes, Sucker Punch Productions is looking for a publisher for its first game.
Founded by former technical assistant to Bill Gates himself, Brian Fleming, Sucker Punch Productions is a young studio looking for a publisher for its first game, Sprocket.
Catchy name.
Yep, very. Sprocket would get a name change before being released for the N64 to Rocket Robot on Wheels. It was a very well-received 3D game with a lot of depth. Now, Sucker Punch would go on to make one of my favorite series of games, the Sly Cooper series for the PlayStation 2, and a little franchise called Infamous, but, who cares about that one? You never played Sly Cooper, right?
No, and I also don't care about Infamous, but yeah.
Yeah, Infamous is take it or leave it. Not my cup of tea, but a lot of people do love it. But Sly Cooper, that's the game series for me. I mean, if you give me cel-shaded, cartoony graphics, a fun Saturday morning cartoon feel storyline, and a little bit of sneaking around and strategy in my action, and literally you can pretty much put anything in front of me and I will pay good money to play it. And Sly Cooper was the perfect mixture of those elements and scratched that itch really good for me.
Yeah, the PS2 era was a time when I was still living under the roof of my parents.
Yeah.
And they were, well, how to say it nicely? They didn't like consoles.
Oh, because they were going to rot your brain because there was no keyboard attached and you weren't going to learn how to do your homework?
They didn't like computer games either.
Okay. So what you're trying to tell me is they were Luddites.
They were what?
Luddites. Old terminology, it basically means somebody who doesn't like technology.
No, it's not about technology. It's just about kids are supposed to, not sit in front of a screen, but to play, And this had resulting from this was as soon as I moved out and I had money.
You basically went whole hog.
I went bananas, dude.
Okay. This explains a lot, actually.
Oh yeah.
Okay. I can understand.
But
this.
I found my inner peace now, so it's good. It's
okay,
fine.
And your inner peace is an Xbox One and a PlayStation 4.
And a Nintendo Switch and a Nintendo 3DS.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Okay, yep. Okay, that explains it. So, yeah, Sucker Punch Productions still going strong. And now...
DreamWorks announces their World War II first-person shooter.
After the success of Saving Private Ryan, DreamWorks Interactive is poised to make an FPS with a similar setting, albeit not at all tied to the plot of the movie. Medal of Honor will be a tactical FPS with lots of historical flourishes. It would also kick off a slew of World War II-based shooters that would end up giving us the massive Battlefront and Call of Duty franchises we have today. So DreamWorks was the studio co-founded by Steven Spielberg, released his movie Saving Private Ryan. That basically was one of the moments when World War II suddenly became extremely fashionable in the media again. And Medal of Honor was a huge breakout because we had been going down at this point this line of gaming where you had Unreal Tournament, Quake 3 Arena. You were getting less and less realistic with the first-person shooters. It was all about massive deathmatch, meat grinder. You die, you come back. You die, you come back. You die, you come back. And suddenly Medal of Honor was an attempt to have a more realistic feeling, to give you a more realistic setting, use a lot more realistic textures and lighting and so forth. And like I said, it gave us Battlefront and Call of Duty. They would not exist. They both start out as World War II shooters. So,
and you could even play it in Arkansas.
And you could even play it in Arkansas. So a very important step, kind of forgotten by a lot of people nowadays. Medal of Honor got a bunch of sequels, even got a really, really horrible port to the Game Boy Advance, which I cannot really recommend to anybody, but watch a video of it on YouTube. It's quite terrible. And yeah, that was about it. Okay.
Well then, let's move on.
Yes.
3D Realms denies Prey has been cancelled. Just postponed almost indefinitely.
Something like that. Since we're sticking with FPSs, 3D Realms, publisher of games such as Duke Nukem 3D, denies rumors that their game Prey, which had been in development since 1995, had been cancelled. Prey was to be released in 1999, but looks to be pushed back to 2000 as the title didn't have a producer at the time of this news report, and an Ion Storm alumnus, Corinne Yu, had just come on board. Ion Storm being the company of John Romero, and who is just hemorrhaging staff as Daikatana keeps drawing on and on and on. And so Corinne Yu has come on board to shepherd the project. The game would eventually miss a 2000 release too, and ultimately not come out until 2006.
I'm just wondering, this game took 11 years of development, and just compare the graphics and the way how gameplay works between 1995 and 2006. How often must this game have been redeveloped during this process?
Completely. I mean, the original demos for the game had completely different storylines, completely different gameplay elements, completely different structures. The 3D models do not have anything in common with one another. The game engines were completely changed out. It's similar to 3D Realms' other eternal development, which was Duke Nukem Forever, which took forever. And also went through a variety of changes, and the original demos looked nothing like the final product, etc., etc. It's just one of those situations. 3D Realms had so much cash at that point and was making still quite a bit of money off of selling some of their older titles, or just using the build engine to make more and more games like Redneck Rampage, Shadow Warrior, and so forth, that they could afford these protracted development cycles without having to produce new product. Prey ultimately did come out, got some decent reviews, but it wasn't the kind of game you'd expect after that many years in development, because, like you said, everything changed so much. There's really very little from the original game that you could still be using that many years later.
And it worked so nice, they did it twice.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And next one.
Zip Drive add-on for Dreamcast in development, and this in 1999.
iomega Corporation and Sega announce a zip drive add-on for the Dreamcast. The 100 megabyte magnetic drive will add more storage to Sega's console, allowing for more information to be downloaded to the system, especially important for add-on maps for FPS titles and browser history. A prototype of the device was made, plugging into the modem port at the bottom of the console, similar to the original Sega CD add-on, with an additional port on the back of the zip drive for the modem, in an ominously familiar setup reminiscent of the 32X CD add-on setup. Considering the rise of CDR and CDRW by 1999, zip drives were on their way out, and there was little point to releasing an add-on by mid-2000. It would have been an interesting idea had it been added to the system out of the box. So
I just don't get why they went into zip drives.
Well, the NES had successfully done this with the disk system in Japan. And the original disk system was a way to do very cheap games that were larger than the cartridges at the time, because disks are cheaper than chips.
Yeah.
And they also allowed you to write things to the disk so you could have save states and so forth. Now, as the memory chips got cheaper, suddenly you could make larger cartridges at affordable prices, and the disks were limited to a certain size. You couldn't get more data on the disk. Now, the idea of adding the zip drive to the Dreamcast actually, at the time, I wasn't quite so sure it was a bad idea due to the fact that the Dreamcast also had a web browser built into it. And this is also a time when there were several companies trying to sell the idea of a web television device. There was even a thing called Web TV, which was actually a set-top box so you could surf the internet from your television set. And not all that crazy of an idea of this ever-present internet, that you were decoupling the internet from a personal computer. Similar to how nowadays we have the internet on all of our devices. I mean, you can have the internet on your smartphone, you can have the internet on your cell phone, you can have the internet on your fridge. This idea was nascently already there, and the idea that you were just going to use the console not to just play games over the internet, but to actually surf the web. It came with a web browser. You could get a keyboard, you could type stuff in. But you were going to need a place to store your browser history, store images that you downloaded, and so forth. And even though the Dreamcast had the VMU, which was a little, it looked like a tiny miniature Game Boy that you plugged into the controller, and it had also could store your save states, it wasn't going to be enough for the kinds of data that was coming online. And since you were going to be constantly updating the browser because there were new versions of HTML coming out, there were new versions of the Flash player coming out, there were new versions of Real Player coming out. If you're going to keep the browser up to date and usable on the internet, you're going to have to be downloading new versions of the browser. Those had to be stored someplace. A device like a zip drive at the time seemed like a decent idea. It's just, as an add-on, it was never going to get the support it needed.
So they basically said, okay, we've lost in the gaming market. Let's see how we can make a cash cow out of it either way.
Well, remember, the Dreamcast has just launched a few months earlier in Japan. It hasn't even launched in North America yet. So if they can actually get the zip drives for the Dreamcast manufactured, they could be a day one add-on for the system.
Yeah, because people like day one spend even more things.
If you're buying a console day one, you're probably a little euphoric and you're going to be willing to spend a little bit more cash. Now, remember, it has a built-in 56K or 64K modem, I can't remember, but it also had the add-on for a high-speed modem. But since so few people had high-speed modems at the time, it didn't matter. Building it into the thing would have been a pointless idea. Remember, the PlayStation 2 is not going to come out for quite a while. That comes out with no built-in modem because the honest answer is the handful of people who are going to use it probably aren't enough to justify the cost of putting it in. By the time the original Xbox comes out and has a network card in it, it's because we have reached critical mass of people with high-speed internet, and they can use the network card to just jack right into their modem and surf. They don't have to have their own dial-up modem in the device anymore. And so Sega's coming out with this at this weird moment in time when the internet is important. It's just not important enough to spend the money to upgrade the hardware inside this console that they have to basically sell at hair-thin margins to begin with.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Still didn't work.
Oh, hell no. Never got released. But they're showing it off, and remember,
we have it, just in case.
Remember, we talked about this last episode. Sony's already breathing down their neck with releasing some of the specs of the PlayStation 2.
Yeah, it really feels like someone who is in panic and is like, okay, we have to show something. Something. Give me something.
Yeah, no. You want a zip drive? We got a zip drive. You want this? We got this. They are basically freaking out at this point and trying to figure out where the market's going to go, and they're just hedging their bets. And iomega is desperate to stay relevant in the face of CDRWs, and let's face it, flash-style memory is just around the corner, just coming. Remember, we talked about the Rio an episode or two ago, which was the first portable MP3 player. This idea of chip memory or portable memory is getting bigger. It's getting more significant everybody knows the writings on the wall for magnetic media. So, okay, but in other fun news from the Orient,
The Tokyo Game Show of Spring '99.
Sega tries to woo the crowd as the only next-gen system on the market at the Spring Tokyo Game Show. Yu Suzuki announces a Shenmue delay, saying they will break the game up into 2 halves, which will each sell for $25. The first part in August and the second part for the holidays. A handful of other titles were shown, but nothing too over the moon. Shenmue is basically Sega's Great White Hope. Now, Yu Suzuki, famous Sega game designer. Some people have compared him to Shigeru Miyamoto. Might be a little unfair, but Yu Suzuki, responsible for such awesome games like Hang On and Space Harrier and Afterburner and Outrun and so on and so forth. And Shenmue was really the first true massive open world game. And it really did show off some amazing stuff. And Part 1 and Part 2 did end up getting released. Unfortunately, Part 3, we're still waiting for it here in June of 2019. It's been kickstarted for quite a while. We're still waiting for that third part to hit the market. So it's finally going to come. It's just a little late.
Episodic games. Way ahead of their time.
Sort of. I mean, it was just the game kept getting bigger and bigger. The budget kept getting bigger and bigger to the point where Sega was never going to be able to turn a profit on this game. It just
So
got
they had
way
one
out of
big
the-
title, and that thing will not make a profit.
Bingo. Yep, that's
I mean, there
that's
must
the
be a
story of it.
reason why the Dreamcast flopped.
Oh, the Dreamcast sold really, really well at the beginning, but it could never gain enough market share because it didn't have the third-party support. Sega did not have enough experience or enough experienced teams to make true console games. They were great at arcade games, but other than some games like Phantasy Star Online and Shenmue and Seaman, there were even Seaman, not a traditional, that was the experimental type game that you would do on a PC, but you wouldn't do on a console. Sega just did not have the development teams to make console experiences, and when the third parties didn't support them, when they didn't have the big sports franchises, when they didn't have the big role-playing games, when they didn't have
Anything.
the big action games. I mean, Konami isn't bringing Metal Gear. EA is not bringing Madden or FIFA. Square is not bringing Final Fantasy. Enix is not going to bring Dragon Warrior. Well, you're basically stuck with your own stable of games, and Sega at this point just doesn't have the cash reserves for extra development.
And there was the PS2, just more or less just about to be launched.
Well, let's talk about that. So now the third parties at the show are not sitting idly by. It's not just about console manufacturers. In 99 is still a time for one-on-one fighters, and Tecmo showed off Dead or Alive 2, running on the Naomi board, while Namco showed off the Dreamcast port of Soul Calibur. Again, these were the two exceptional titles. Naomi board was basically a Dreamcast for the arcade, and Soul Calibur would become a launch title for the Dreamcast in North America, and pretty much the biggest seller at launch in North America, other than the Sonic game that came out. And so, there's a little bit of activity going on here, but this is too little too late, especially one-on-one fighters. It's an arcade genre. It's not going to move consoles anymore. The PlayStation 1 made its bones with 3D jump and runs and role-playing games, the Final Fantasy VIIs and the Metal Gear Solids and so forth. And finally, Sony doesn't flinch. No demos of the PS2 are shown, and they just have a small assortment of nice-looking but otherwise unimpressive titles for the PlayStation 1, like Spyro, Jamalami, and Omega Boost. Next Gen Magazine wonders just how confident they are in their market position.
It's a little bit like this year's E3 where they're like, no, we don't attend.
Yeah, I mean, there is something to be said. The E3 situation that we have right now, I think, is a little bit different because even though Sony is the leader in this generation, things like Stadia and the post-console world might be playing a role there. But to be honest with you, we're going to have to see in retrospect. There may be things going on behind the scenes at Sony that we won't know about for several years.
And we won't tell you about...
depending on how long this runs, but that might actually put their decision this year into a whole new light. They may have something behind closed doors right now that may justify their decision to not be there this year. And we won't know about it for quite a while. So I'm always skeptical about trying to make these historical comparisons this close to an event.
You can't do that. No. Never.
So, but
it's just fun though.
At this point, Sony really is just that confident in their position. They know if Microsoft joins, if they've heard anything about Microsoft joining, they're at least 2 years out. They know the Dreamcast has no software support, even though we've been talking about how Konami has promised to bring some games and Namco has promised to bring some games. At this point, this close to the PS2's launch, they know that they're going to get the exclusive Metal Gear Solid game. They know they're going to get the exclusive Square games. They know that Sega has no leg to stand on. They have no reason to spend money and try to poo-poo Sega. If they go out there and say, oh, but the PlayStation 1 is still awesome, Sega can easily counter that by saying, but look how many polygons we got. Look how pretty our games are. They don't want to do that. They're just like, hey, you guys already own a PlayStation. Here's some more games. Enjoy them. Ooh, we've got the open world Spyro game. It's great. All they have to do now is wait. They just have to ride out this wave one more year, and then they're going to come in and they're going to clobber Sega, and they know it. So that's pretty much what's happening here. Okay. Also, sticking with Japan for just a little bit longer.
Yeah, Namco calls on arcade game...
Arcade.
Jesus, this language. Again, Namco calls on... Help me?
Arcade. Like a pirate.
Arcade. Namco calls on arcade game makers to up their game.
Masaya Nakamura, and I'm killing that, I'm sure. Founder and chairman of Namco says the arcade industry had better shape up if it wants to survive in competition with the internet and console games. We, quote, we have to make a bigger difference between consumer and arcade games to have any future, end quote. Namco's reaction is research into networked arcade games and touch screens. So
that worked out.
Namco is really kind of worried here, and it makes sense. At the Tokyo Game Show, all the high-tech arcade games are running off of console hardware. And that fact is reflected in what is going on in the actual arcades. At this point, when you walked into an arcade, the games looked no better or worse, really, than what you could play at home on a PlayStation. And even though the Dreamcast was coming, the Naomi board games, there were maybe a couple already in their arcade, but it wasn't a lot of them yet. And so if you wanted to keep the people coming into the arcade, if you wanted to wow them into leaving their homes, you're going to have to do something more than just take the arcade board and say, ooh, now you can play another one-on-one fighting game. And so this idea of research into networked arcade games and touchscreens did have a little bit of play in Japan. I mean, there are touchscreen games nowadays. There's
also
games where you move in front of them, of course, no doubt about it, and less traditional joystick and button combination based games, especially in Japanese arcades. But of course, each one of these unique control setups meant that you had to create an extra cabinet, which meant you had to hire costs, which meant that your development was higher, it meant the per unit sale to the arcade was higher, which meant that you're going to have to pull in more revenue, which meant that the risk of losing money increased with each one of these new experiments. So, difficult times are on the horizon for the arcade, and the arcade would ultimately suffer and, at least in North America, pretty much disappear in its traditional form. Sad but true.
Back to all companies go broke.
Something like that.
All right.
On
but
to
before they get broke. On to more. They tease stuff. Turrican 3D teased.
So, back to Europe. A 20-man team is hard at work taking the classic 8 and 16-bit platform shooter and turning it into a 3D open-world game. Sadly, this would not come to fruition, and the game would be cancelled shortly thereafter. To this day, we are still waiting for a proper Turrican sequel. Have you ever played Turrican?
Sometimes I can't sleep because I'm so eagerly waiting.
Okay, see,
No, I haven't.
probably the most well-known German game ever is Turrican. Developed by Manfred Trenz, a prodigy programmer on the Commodore 64.
It's not Settlers.
No, not really. Not on an international scale. Settlers outside of outside of
Okay,
Germany.
on an international
Really,
scale.
Settlers is kind of like whatever. I got time before the next civilization shows up.
Well,
And
fair enough.
I love Settlers 1. Settlers 2 was fun, but there's some bad apples in that batch.
Well, that's true.
Yeah, but Turrican really was this massive hit. Hit like a bomb on both the Commodore 64 and the Amiga. Then got ported in various forms to the Game Boy, the Game Gear, the NES, the Super Nintendo, the Genesis, the TurboGrafx 16. Everybody got some version of Turrican. And it was in itself kind of a hybrid of different concepts between the traditional European action-adventure with exploration elements, some liberally taken ideas from Metroid and a few other games. And Manfred Trenz really did a spectacular job. 8-way scrolling, parallax and everything else on a Commodore 64. And then Factor 5 made their bones doing the 16-bit ports to the Atari ST and the Amiga. And Factor 5 would later go on to create games for Lucasfilm, including Rogue Squadron. So the Turrican has a lot of foundation. Very, very important game for a lot of developers. And unfortunately, this 3D attempt to update the game would come to naught.
Yeah, the German gaming industry isn't what it was.
Well, it wasn't. It was.
Moving on.
The German gaming industry has always had to work under extreme restrictions, unfortunately.
Yeah, somehow.
Yeah. So, and our final story for this month.
And this is something that I really like to announce. Sennheiser introduces the Surrounder.
Well, this is just freaking dumb.
Thank you.
If you ever want to look like an evil sci-fi villain and hear sounds behind your ears as well as in front of you, then Sennheiser has the peripheral for you. The Surrounder is a wonderful, basically it kind of looks like it's made out of black painted styrofoam device that you hang around your neck like a giant,
It's
collar
a
or a
boombox,
very
man.
small life preserver that has 4 speakers built into it that you can then plug into either a PC or a surround sound system and hear the sounds all around you. We're going to include a video of somebody actually testing this in the show notes. It really is cringeworthy to see. And Sennheiser thought, this is how we're really going to get all those people in front of the PC to adopt surround sound by wearing a giant uncomfortable collar.
Do we actually know how heavy that thing is?
The guy in the video does describe it. He doesn't say it's all that heavy. I mean, it's basically styrofoam. But it was not comfortable after a relatively short period of time. So I cannot
preventing
imagine
you
that it was
from
good.
playing for too long.
you probably would not want to play it for too long, no. So, yes, the Surrounder from Sennheiser, basically a bad idea. Yeah, not ahead of its time, not behind its time,
Just a bad idea.
There you go. Okay, that closes out our voyage through time for the month of June 2019. Any final words, Peter?
You know, we've been recording for 3 hours, 4 hours.
Nah, not that long. It's been about 3.5 hours.
3 hours.
Yeah, and it'll be less by the time people hear this, so yes.
Oh, so I can actually say something.
No, but go ahead anyway.
No, I want to cut it short. I just say thank you for listening.
Exactly. And remember, if you have any feedback for us, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email. The link's in the description. Contact us on Twitter. We try to be as active as possible on there. And if you really like what we're doing, chug us a buck. Send us a buck on Patreon. It helps take a little bit of the sting out of the cost of doing the show and running the show and hosting the show, primarily just the hosting the show. But at the same time, it's also kind of a nice feeling to know you guys appreciate it. So with that being said, look forward to talking to you all again next month. Have fun. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. And adios.
Bye.